So it's been over a year since I started this series that analyzes the Persona 5 royal characters in proper Japanese context. And to date, we've successfully explored all 10 party members. And now, after this long journey, we've finally arrived at the last major character, the questionable counselor turned nicest antagonist himself, Takuto Maruki. So today we're doing a deep dive on Maruki, his huge impact on the story, and how it draws attention to the way Japanese people view mental health and the services provided to treat such things. Now, this should go without saying, but unlike all my other P5 analysis videos, this one will have huge royal spoilers throughout the entirety of it, for obvious reasons. So what are you even doing here right now? Go do yourself a favor and experience Royal's peak storytelling. So in case you've missed my Kasumi video, I'd like to establish the baseline used in all my P5 analyses. And yes, this includes Royal even after Katsura Hashino, the base game's director, had already left the series while P5R was still in development. It's important to keep Hashino's authorial intent in mind because Royal still had to be thematically cohesive with the vanilla story, since it just sprinkled in new storyline for the first 90% of the game. So, in one of my previous videos, I brought up how director Hashino and his team specifically crafted P5's narrative to focus on societal issues within their home country. He confirmed in various interviews that P5 is unabashedly Japanese and intentionally addressed recent political scandals at the time. And as we can see in the game, the narrative focuses on the injustices that outcasts face within Japanese society, meaning a greater understanding of P5 can be achieved via learning about actual Japanese culture. Or in other words, viewing it from the perspective of the audience it was specifically developed for. And sure, there will always be some degree of understanding and relatability across cultures, but it can't be overstated how different Japanese cultural values are from those of the wider Western or Eurocentric world. For example, Japan and wider Asia's collectivist values place emphasis on group cohesion over the self, while the individualistic values of the West favor the freedom of the individual over the collective. This means that sticking to the natural societal order of things is extra important in collectivist Japan. Now, with all of that said, I'm quite confident that the royal team wished to honor Hashino's authorial intent, meaning Maruki's character has something meaningful to say about Japanese society. And even if my interpretation isn't actually their official intent, I still think it's important to discuss how Maruki's story indirectly highlights the difficulties counselors and therapists face regarding Japan's mental health services as they currently stand, mostly because of the still existing clash between traditional Japanese values and the Western approach to therapy. But before we dive into all of that, let's get a better grasp of Maruki's personality first. From what we see in his confidant, he genuinely comes across as a kind and empathetic person. In rank 4, we learn he got all scratched up in order to save a kitten stuck in a tree. He's also very thoughtful. I mean, he's not called Dr. Snack by the community for nothing. He provides goodies at his office and also treats Joker to nice meals sometimes to thank him. And even though he's definitely an unethical counselor, which hits home by the way since I'm beholden to the same ethical standards as a social work grad, that shouldn't take away from the fact that Maruki cares for other people and has empathy for anyone who is going through a difficult time. I bring all this up because it helps show that Maruki isn't a malicious character. He had no intention of harming people, and even believed he was helping them. But how did he wind up at Shujin in the first place? Well, it all started a couple years ago with Rumi and how he unconsciously altered her cognition with the help of his budding persona. It was done in the heat of the moment, while Rumi was going through an awful post-traumatic attack. And seeing a loved one going through that much pain, I'm sure most of us would have said yes to the opportunity if it really was possible. But because wiping away someone's trauma would normally be impossible, of course, Maruki surely wasn't thinking of what it'd actually do to Rumi. He only wanted to ease her pain. Little did he know at that exact moment that it would end up costing him deeply. Maruki's profound loss that day would be the catalyst for everything culminating in the third semester. He doubles down on his research to distract himself from this painful loss, only to lose his research to Shido's conspiracy. And then Maruki's drinking gets out of hand that night, until at last we see him swearing to Rumi that he will help every single person. And so he goes on to become a counselor. Now, it's unknown just how many of his patients' cognitions he actually rewrote. But we know for certain he did this to Sumire. Maruki is clearly using his ability to take away from his actual pain and trauma, and instead of actually sorting through his own grief, he's using this grandiose vision of his to achieve happiness for all people as his own form of self-medication. You know, just like the many people who develop substance abuse problems in an effort to distract themselves from the pain in their own lives. So with all of this said, I don't want to take away from the fact that his loss over Rumi is the main catalyst behind this deluded vision of his. However, I also think something specific about Japan's view of mental health services is also responsible for Maruki's feeling of desperation and even perhaps obligation to save all people. So that's what I want to talk about for pretty much the rest of this video. A concept I've encountered time and time again in my social work experience is that it's impossible to grasp the entirety of a person without looking at their sociocultural environment. So with that said, we need to examine the cultural values Maruki is surrounded by every minute of every single day. And because Maruki's career is counseling, I believe it's crucial for us to understand Japan's view on mental health and the services provided to treat it. So, Japan has adopted a Western approach to medicine since the 19th century, which also includes the kind of mental health services provided. But in many ways, this Western treatment for mental health clashes with traditional Japanese, or just East Asian in general, values. We talked about collectivist versus individualistic cultures earlier, and how it results in Japanese people placing much more emphasis on what the group or others think of them. That's in large part why there's such an intense stigma to save face, or in other words, never talk about one's problems in front of anyone who is not part of the immediate family. It's seen as shameful to seek out help for troubles of any kind outside a person's family, and that's doubly so for problems involving mental illness. As I talked about before in my Ryuji video, struggling with mental health is generally viewed as a reflection of one's character in Japan, meaning that someone who struggles with this would be seen as a bad or weak person. And yes, I'm aware that stigma towards mental health still exists in Western nations to some extent as well. It's just that the underlying cause is different, and I want to make sure people know why the stigma currently exists in many countries in the East, or i.e. those with Confucian backgrounds. But also in general, I'll still always argue that seeking help for mental illness is much more suffocating in Japan, especially for a developed country, compared to all the Western counterparts. For example, just looking at the proportion of mental health service providers for Japan's population compared to the United States says a lot about how seriously the general populace in each country views this topic. Japan has around 51,000 mental health workers for a population of over 128 million people, while the US has 236,000 workers available for the 328 million people living in the States. This comes out to only 51 mental health service providers for every 128,000 people in Japan. Meanwhile, the US proportionally has many more providers, with 59 for every 82,000 people. And as always, all my sources are in the links below. But yeah, I think this comparison aptly reinforces the image that there's a much bigger shortage of trained providers in Japan, probably in no large part thanks to the current lack of demand due to the cultural tradition of avoiding help outside the family. So with this context in mind, Maruki's conversation with Joker in Rank 6 really begins to mean something. He talks about the disadvantages of mental health counseling, how it's such a long process to gain an understanding of another person's heart, let alone the efforts to start mending it. But what really stood out to me was when he said his job as a counselor makes him all too aware of these difficulties, which in this case would definitely include how great of an uphill battle it is to get the average Japanese person to see a therapist in the first place. This is partly why a big portion of the Japanese audience thought Maruki's existence alone was so forward-thinking on Atlas's part. And that's without even getting to his interactions with the students, aka his clients. This brings us to the next section regarding the client and therapist relationship in Japan. In one of my other P5 videos, we talked about how hierarchical relationships are the norm in Japan. It begins from childhood, where older siblings have authority over their younger siblings. Then when a person gets to middle and high school, respecting the senpai and kohai relationship becomes the next most important thing. And as one transitions into the workforce, this relationship translates into older and more experienced employees having authority over the younger ones. I think a lot of this cultural nuance gets lost in translation, such as Ryuji's "those rotten adults" lines being made into more of a meme, though it is a very real thing in Japan. The average Japanese adolescent wouldn't dare go up against an adult's authority. So, since hierarchical relationships are the norm in Japanese people's everyday lives, they naturally take form during mental health counseling between therapists and clients. It's common for clients to behave or answer in an ideal way, or in other words, say what they think the therapist wants to hear. Clients also look to the counselor for definitive advice or answers, rather than being open to arriving at them via inward reflection and talk therapy. An experienced counselor from Japan who is also well acquainted with Western psychotherapy shared that many of the clients she sees would be labeled as dependent through a Western lens, when really this behavior is just the way Japanese clients show respect to those they see as authority figures. And as for Japanese counselors, many reciprocate and fulfill their expected role, adopting a more formal attitude when meeting with clients. This is why Maruki's demeanor was a surprise to many Japanese players, since he talks so casually with all the students, even goofing off and employing humor in ways most adult/authority figures in P5 would never be caught doing. But at the same time, I can't help but think that the expectations from being seen as an authority figure, coupled with the fact that collectivist societies look out for the group's well-being over one's own, played a factor in Maruki's grand delusion to help everyone. There's multiple instances in his confidant where he talks about the need to be good at his job. Like in rank 4, he mentions needing to do more research to get better as a counselor, and in rank 5's follow-up call, he tells Joker he really may be a better counselor than he himself is. Now, ultimately I may be reaching, but knowing that many characters in P5 crumble due to society's enormous expectations of them, I argue that there's a part of Maruki who felt that pressure as well. Meaning it's not only what happened with Rumi that drove him to his misguided desperation. In rank 6, he talks about how the typical psychotherapy, or aka talk therapy, takes too long to help many people at all. And this is if the clients are even forthright about their problems in the first place, which we know to be a substantial problem in Japan. It may just be my interpretation, but I feel like Maruki thinks he's not doing enough for clients if he isn't just straight up solving all their issues and pain for them. Thus his search for more extreme methods until at last we arrive at the 3rd semester. With all this being said, none of it justifies his actions, of course. This knowledge just helps explain it, but does not excuse it. But now that we've discussed Maruki's surrounding environment in detail, all I've got left for this video are some final thoughts and conclusions. Like so many of you, I was absolutely blown away by Maruki's role in P5R and the difficult questions he brought to the surface. It was such a breath of fresh air to have an adult persona user again, and also so rare to have a human antagonist who wasn't doing just outright evil, i.e. the earlier palace rulers. Though don't get me wrong, Maruki was still in the wrong for imposing on others what he himself believed would make them happy, when really only a single individual can decide their own happiness. And as a social work grad myself, who has some experience in this field, Maruki's dilemma hit close to home. Counselors, therapists, or anyone who is in this kind of helping profession needs to get comfortable with the idea that sometimes, no matter how much you try to help a client, ultimately their prognosis hinges upon themselves and their own desire to change their mentality and/or lifestyle. And it's just impossible for a therapist to have a solution for every client, since each solution is up to the individual and therefore subjective by nature. But speaking of Maruki's counseling, he definitely was guilty of some unethical practices. For one, he was so unprofessional with Joker, since he really shouldn't have been so casual with the client, especially asking him for his help with his research, exchanging private contact information, and going out to places together. Though I understand this was the only way for the plot to really progress in the game. The Thought Bubble also brought up a really great point in his video on Maruki, drawing attention to how he took advantage of Sumire again after re-traumatizing her via playing the Kasumi flashback scene. While it certainly wasn't for malicious reasons, it obviously was quite a manipulative thing for Maruki to do. I highly recommend giving his entire Maruki video a watch if you haven't already, by the way, found in the cards or in the description. And lastly, I think Atlus did a fantastic job choosing a new job for Maruki in the end there. I talked about it a bit before in my other P5 video, but a taxi driver is really fitting since it still allows him to get to hear about people's lives a little bit without having to be responsible for the outcome of them, like a therapist would be. But when it comes to his grief over Rumi, I really do hope Maruki is able to come to terms with it. It's sad to think he can't get any real therapy for it though, since there's no way a counselor could understand any of the Persona and Metaverse related shenanigans. But I'd love to hear what you guys think about all this. Was this ending for Maruki satisfying for you? Or would you have liked to see something different? And what do you think Maruki's up to now? I'd love to know in the comments. But yeah, those were my most pressing thoughts on Maruki. He's definitely made it on my favorite antagonists of any medium list, so big props to Atlus. But with that said, please like the video if you liked it and to help me out with the algorithm. Check out all my other analyses and subscribe for more Persona content. I have some P5 Arcana symbolism and P4 character stuff coming up. Join our lovely Discord community if you wish, follow me on Twitter and on Twitch, and lastly, I want to thank all my amazing patrons, especially Jared Brelland, Andreas Hansen, Captain Hobo, NT Luck, Big Clingy, Sam Bezjak, Thomas Perez Jr., Francesco Santoyo Rego, Silverwind847, Sathya Selvaraja, M. Meownalin, Gigi Sora, Malcolm Lowry, and Platinum Rose. Thanks for watching, and until next time guys, take care. See ya!